Good morning. How are you? I'm Alan Blum, and I'm a family physician at the University of Alabama. And the last time I was in this room was 5 years ago when Emory Waters and I presented the opera that he created, Drawing Patients Closer. So it's good to be back. Thank you for coming. Honored to be joined this morning by the former foreign correspondent and bureau chief of Newsweek and one of the greatest authors of modern history, Andy Nagorski, whose latest book is, they're already lining up at the Amherst bookstores, so he will be there a little later today, and good. It's The Year Germany Lost the War, just out. The copies just came in yesterday, right? Okay. And also joined by David Micklemore, who you will remember from those of us who read avidly every word of the Amherst Student, the editor of the Amherst Student, and then a distinguished foreign correspondent, and for many, many decades, at least, I don't know, how many, the assistant managing editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, David Micklemore. So I wrote to Pete and Bill and Rob and put in a little abstract for a session on digital media addiction, which I call the zombie apocalypse. And I teach at the University of Alabama. About 5 years ago, I was asked to give a talk at the library school graduation. And on my way over, you walk across this beautiful quad. And yes, that's right, George Wallace stood at the schoolhouse door. And now they make a big deal like, oh, this is our, look how we're recognizing that great historic moment. You know, like they did this week, you know, when they passed that great law. But don't worry, I'm on the witness protection program, so it's, I noticed something, and I've been noticing it, but as I walked across the quad, everybody's, you know, they're all immersed, they're all wired, nobody's looking up. I could have been, I joked, I could have walked nude across the quad. Not only would nobody have noticed, a couple of them might have just done this, I would have on Snapchat, but people are not looking up. So I coined the term that day, a new slogan for the library school, looking up for librarians. But it got me thinking about maybe working with some students, and for the last few years I've worked with an undergraduate student, Tom Gruchella, to look at his fellow students in the undergraduate community at the university on the subject of digital media addiction. And I submitted this abstract, and Rob, in his infinite wisdom, said, well, that's good, but why don't we combine it with these distinguished journalists, and David Corcoran, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and let's blend it into a session on digital media and the addiction of today's generation with the survival of what we knew to be the grand print media. And with that in mind, kind of a subset title I came up with after Rob's idea to blend these sessions is The Fading Art of Observation, because I think that what my contention is that, and again, if Dick Aronson's here, you know, he'll be like in the corner, always bringing us back to optimism. But me, this isn't one of those optimistic, so I'm only on for about 12 minutes, but it's not going to be the happiest 12 minutes you've ever spent. Because I don't see any way out of this. And that's right, put down your cell phone. And, oh, I forgot to say, you've got to turn them off for this, because, I've always remembered this CBS 60 Minutes story in 2003 called The Eyes Have It. And it's by Professor John Stilgoe, who teaches Harvard students one of the most popular courses he's still teaching. And I'll show you a little excerpt of this 60 Minutes piece, and you'll get the idea of why I thought it was fascinating. And let me just play a little bit to see where he's coming from and how the power of observation, the art of observation, is fading. So let's see, Eli, there we go, and...
If you've ever wondered what it would be like to take a class at Harvard, you're about to find out from one of the university's most distinguished and popular professors. But don't worry, he doesn't teach advanced calculus or nuclear physics or ancient Greek literature. In fact, if you were the kind of student who spent all your time staring out the classroom window, then Professor John Stilgoe's classes may be just for you, because looking around is exactly what he teaches.
Come on, let's go down the alley. Alleys are good things. They're good for cats. They're good for looking around.
His title at Harvard is Professor in the History of Landscape, but his classes don't have much to do with bushes and flowers. He's much more interested in the urban ecosystem that has been shaped and repaved over the centuries, like the vast underground world beneath our feet.
That's a nice grating. I haven't a clue what's down there. There's a ladder.
A lot of wires.
When Stilgo took me along on the same walk he takes his students through in Cambridge, it turned into a march through the American industrial past.
Boston Elevated Railway.
Here's a relic from a long-extinct trolley company. And there's a memorial of sorts to the American steel industry.
It probably has a casting date on it someplace. 1968, cast in Alabama. And if you move along looking at cast iron on streets, you'll eventually come upon the newest stuff that was cast in India. This is genuinely a wilderness.
He teaches the art of exploration, discovering the built environment, which can include everything from architecture and history to advertising and design. He introduces his students to a method of discovering a hidden world that's always been right there in front of their eyes.
I start by showing slides of things that they think they have seen, and it turns out they haven't seen. The white arrow that's on the side of every FedEx truck is a nice place to start. Before they've learned to read, toddlers will see the arrow, and I've asked toddlers, do you see the arrow on the truck? They usually do.
So where's the arrow?
The arrow is between the lower half of the capital E and the X.
Right there.
Right there.
I've never seen it.
Well, you have now. And the nice thing about it is, you see, you've seen it. And usually when I point it out, people say, oh, I've never seen that before, but of course it's right there.
Professor John Stilgo says the arrow is just one of millions of things that are right in front of our eyes that we never notice.
Now, all of this stuff is a world that nobody sees or nobody thinks about.
I think people see it, but most people, when they learn to read, stop looking around. I try very hard in this university, which selects students based almost entirely on how well they do with words and numbers, to teach them that there's another way of knowing.
This other way of knowing is simply using your eyes. The power of acute observation is one of nature's most useful tools for learning. But Stilgo says the constant blur of modern life has caused us to lose it over the years.
I think we have, and I think there are good reasons we've lost it. I mean, I don't tell people to start looking in 360 degrees while they're driving a car. But if you were jogging along in a horse and buggy 100 years ago, you could look around. And I have people now who really have never been told to slow down, look around, take a nice walk. Instead, they go jogging or running to increase their heart rate. And I tell them, why not look around while you're doing it and increase some kind of rate in your mind?
Harvard, he says, is some of the finest students in the world, but he believes most of them are visually illiterate. Their academic lives have been programmed around verbal and mathematical tests that will get them into a good college. But he says they lack a sense of spontaneity.
I think they've missed a kind of self-guided, non-organized activity, non-sports activity growing up. They're wandering around, getting into things. And the assumption seems to be nowadays is if a child isn't in an organized activity, the child is a criminal, right? But, I mean, as far as I can understand, that most of my colleagues I worked with seem to have found their careers by being slightly disorganized, lucking into something, you know?
Which is exactly what happened with...
Well, I'll give you an idea. You know, I called Professor Stilgo because I've watched this for many years. I've shown this to people. And the reason that this is so important to me to show is because remember the date that this was done, 2003. So I had to ask him the question. This is at least 5 years before our current smartphone permeations. And I said, so you did this before smartphones came out. What do you think of now? And he could barely contain himself. He went on for another half an hour. So think about it. Even before smartphones, we're talking about a generation that had lost the power of observation. And, you know, for many years, when I've worked on the tobacco issue and other issues, I'm like the guy in the old Philadelphia Bulletin advertising campaign in the New Yorker, where he's trying to get everybody's attention, and they're reading the Bulletin. In Philadelphia, nearly everybody reads the Bulletin. Or the pool shark, you know, he's trying to call, there's actually a pool shark there, but nobody's paying attention because they're reading the Bulletin. It's ironic that I would use an example of the print medium. And yesterday I went to Hastings and got 7 newspapers. And I said, I'm number 1 today. She said, no, there's a guy that gets about 10, you know. So there's a few of us left. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the concern that I have is this, is the everyday experience that I see all day long at the university. And you go into classrooms, and this is what you see. A quote from a book called Are We All Addicts Now? In recent years, I've noticed a growing contradiction, the author writes, between the demands for deep attention and criticality in the university and an increasing number of hyper-attentive students obsessively and compulsively checking social media notifications. Outside the campus, too, the world appears to be ever more populated by crowds of zombie-like screen addicts. But that was an unrehearsed picture of a classroom. Let's just take a picture of a random classroom. And in the medical field in which I am, now, of course, we're not going to get physicians talking about computer addiction when we ourselves are hooked on the electronic medical record, which has this cyber language. A 6-month-old comes in complaining of leg pain. I mean, it's astounding what it translates into. And so a few years ago, I saw this article that talks about the proper way to bring your laptop, to teach the med students to bring their laptop in the room with the patient and do it the right way. You're not supposed to put the laptop right in front of you. No, you're supposed to put it on the side like this. And as if that excuses bringing in a machine to interfere with your computer-physician relationship, to your computer-patient relationship. And they loved it so much that they wrote another article, and they even named it. They called it the doctor-patient electronic health record triangle. This is the kind of crap that I have to deal with in academia instead of talking about the patient. They got promoted for this, And so our talk was going to be, the one I wanted to do was called Zombie Apocalypse or Digital Media Addiction on Campus. And just to summarize, there's lots of terms for digital media addiction. These are all the different devices. I didn't put video games there, but those are the ones that we think of, the social media websites and the devices themselves. And let's not forget that there are some upsides. I'm sure that we could go through, all the good things. I know when my wife was traveling, it was good that she was able to go through the forest with a cell phone, and when you were otherwise unable to reach someone. So there's a safety element there. You can pay for things. You can shop. You can have all the wonders of medical care. Didn't you see that cartoon of the dilemma whether he was going to recharge his cell phone or save the life of the patient? And, let's face it, there's everything has an upside and a downside. But I think, to me, the list of the downsides would be most concerning, if not more outweighing the upsides. Cyberbullying, if you saw the wonderful exhibition on mental health and the students sharing their stories, I don't think that's helped by the social media, the social norms that people believe are out there, the dieting, the anorexia that's related to people looking at images on screens all day. Gaming addiction is now an official disorder, just as ESPN is starting the new e-sports channel. I mean, it's astounding. We're going further and further into this what they call the dopamine mining industry, that's mining the dopamine that we're charging our brain with every time we click on something that we think we like. And as you'll see, I think there's diminished social skills, and there are mental and physical health problems already being documented. For instance, the notion of, well, these are actually the other terms. There are several that I've found: compulsive computer use, virtual addiction, internet addiction disorder, pathological internet use. These have all been bandied about. And the question I'd raise is the internet just a medium to fuel other addictions and compulsions, such as gaming, gambling, shopping, sex, and work? And the fact it's so difficult to get yourself off of these. So these are some of the documented health problems. I love that. That's supposed to be an educational image. But she's doing the proper way to walk around like a zombie, Computer vision screen actually does relate to eye strain, and it could be a permanent condition. Imagine staring at a 1-inch screen all day long. It's not going to do great things for your eyes. The element of sleep quality. If you've read this week, the teenagers, 90% of teenagers are going to sleep with their smartphones, and they're waking up several times a night. Now kids are using burner phones because when the parents confiscate them, they'll go buy burner phones. It's astounding. It's worse than you think. What's the average high school senior girl? How many hours a day is she now on her smartphone? Oh, good. I don't need to be Dick Emerson to say, no, it's not that bad. But it's closer, it's getting closer to 12 hours a day of waking up. And that, you know, she'll say, but no, that's a lot of that is school. It's the hard thing to distinguish between educational and work-related legitimate uses and the non-work-related, non-educational uses. It's that fine line of which is going into the other. Weight gain from being sedentary. We've added 1 hour of sedentary behavior in just the last 6 years. 1 hour, all of us, 1 hour, and teenagers too, 1 more hour of sitting 6.5 hours a day now. And it's astounding what's going on. Of course, to my mind, and I'm sure Rob was interested in having me make the point of mental health issues, depression is at its highest level among teenagers, we think now, especially among that age group. Cyberbullying, exposure to graphic content are not helping us. It fosters avoidance of social interaction. Those diagnosed with ADHD seem to be spending more time on their devices. Whether there's an attention deficit disorder or some distractibility inherent, we don't know. I think parental relationships are part of that, but ADHD has been associated with, and distractibility in general. This overall notion of the loss of attentiveness, the idea that multitasking is legitimate. We all think we can do it, but it turns out multitasking is a myth. We don't accomplish, on any objective measure, what we think we're doing by multitasking when we use our digital devices. And fortunately, in Hawaii, you can't cross a crosswalk with the digital device in your hand. That's the one little hopeful sign. And in France, the education minister has banned smartphones in under 9th grade because the kids during recess were sitting around texting and not going out and playing. We've heard of phubbing, when you're, yes, yeah, I'm listening, when they're really paying more attention to the computer. And literally, we all know the ravages of diminished intimacy, and this is not helping. The threat to autonomy, that has to do with the possessiveness of certain paramours with their boyfriends or girlfriends, and being in touch with them at all times. And it's affecting childhood development, and obviously the physical activity. The 3 things that I look at when one of my residents comes and talks about ADHD is, what about the parental situation? Is there an intact family? Has there been disruption? What's their physical activity and what's their screen time? And here's something. It's a classroom in a college. The students would divide up into 3. One group said you cannot bring your smartphones. The second group said you can bring them, but you better not turn them on. The third group said you can use them as often as you want. So which group did best at the end of the semester? Ones that didn't have them. They did by far the best. What was the second group? A tie. The point is, even if you just have it out there, and it's that fear of missing out. So it's astounding what we're seeing already. So I call it a kind of anti-social media. We're really not getting to the civility that I believe we once had here. And the test of that is walk around on most university campuses and see if people do stop and talk. I think fortunately in the last few days, maybe they're on order to do that to us. But when I've been here to give talks during the school year, I haven't sensed that this is a whole lot different from the University of Alabama in terms of people being wired. And the notion of moving into our segue here, I love print. And I grew up in New York where there were 9 dailies. Often I read every one to catch the different way the baseball games were written about. And here's Newsweek that used to be advertised as fast, factual, and fair. And boy, was that great. What a great, the physicality of just getting your Newsweek in the mail and opening up and of course, who could be better than all the news that's fit to print? And now, we laugh at this, but it played a big role a couple of years ago in an election. And this is the kind of stuff that we laughed at. But do you remember this? Let's see if this works. Can we?
Hey guys, it's Kayla back with another video.
Let me see. I'm going to just see if I can play this. Does it? See if it play. This is from the check the.
Hey guys, it's Kayla back with
I'll play
another
this
video.
Instead, but that was going to be check the tabloids.
So, the topic of today's video is being yourself. Being yourself can be hard, and it's like, aren't I always being myself? And yeah, for sure. But being yourself is like not changing yourself to impress someone else. A lot of people call me quiet or shy or whatever.
People seen this movie?
Quiet.
Anybody see 8th grade?
Kayla Day.
I don't talk a lot at school, but if people talk to me and stuff, they'd find out that I'm like really funny and cool and talkative. By the way, I like your shirt a lot. It's like so cool. What?
One more week of 8th grade, huh?
Huh?
I said one more week of 8th grade, right?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, huh? Okay, so growing up can be a little bit scary and weird.
We will begin to explore these changing bodies of yours. It's gonna be lit.
Don't hold back, I wanna break free.
As always, make sure to share and subscribe to my channel. Gucci!
I think you're so cool. Maybe you just need to put yourself out there a little.
I'm gonna stop eating with you if you keep doing
you said I could
this.
say one thing.
I'm really like nervous all the time. I try really hard not to feel that way. But you just need to face your fears and let people know the real you.
Just grab my phone. How to charge it?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I charge it too. But my phone, Just because things are happening right now doesn't mean they're always gonna happen.
What was in there?
Just sort of my hopes and dreams.
Right.
I was a complete mess when I was your age.
Really?
8th grade is the worst.
You never know what's next. And that's what makes things exciting and scary and fun.
When did you get Snapchat? What grade?
5th grade.
5th grade? What? Yo, see?
Well, I fell in love with that movie, and I hope that you get the idea that, you know, this is unfortunately what I think we're facing. We're in the middle of this entirely new medium. I'd like to sort of turn it back to where I grew up and what I fell in love with and wanted to be a journalist like these guys too. But what do you think, Andy and Peter? Is there hope?
Fact check.
That's what you
All right. Well, thanks. You know, I share a lot of those, those same impressions. But I think I start out with two things. I think David would agree with me. We are not going back to the hard copy age. I love hard copy. The one place, by the way, where hard copy still works is books. I mean, there's still a large proportion of people who buy books. The trend towards more e-books has really slowed. But yeah, first of all, I think it's worth reminding ourselves, and I like to remind students when I come in to talk about what it was like reporting and working as a journalist. My first job that had anything to do with journalism between my freshman and sophomore year here at Amherst, I was a copy boy at the New York Times, and of course it was copy boy. And my first job in the morning, I say, this is a little quiz for you, is taking the glue pots off editors' desks, taking them to a back room, scraping off the congealed crud at the top, and stirring the glue pots and putting them back on the editor's desk. And I say, why was I doing that? And I get these blank looks. You like to sniff glue? And I explained, where do you think cut and paste comes from? And that's when I started at Newsweek, my stories. And when I heard the whir of the electric typewriter of my editor, I knew he wasn't just pencil editing. He was writing new things and then cutting and pasting and bam. So there was that whole, the whole nature of writing and so forth has changed. And a lot of it, I think, for the better in the sense that, there'd be times I'd be, especially as a foreign correspondent, in places where it's very hard to file or get past military censors and so forth. And now with the, it's instantaneous. You don't have telex machines, something else that nobody knows what they were. And you didn't have to hand carry or fly out of a place sometimes to file. You could get phone connections, but there was an upside. And the upside was, especially working for a news magazine, I go off, say, somewhere in a provincial Russian city where there was almost no communication. And my editors knew I was out of pocket, and I had that 2 or 3 days, which in journalism is a real luxury, to just wander around, talk to people, observe, and the serendipity factor of things you learned was huge. And as opposed to going in and trying to get that quick quote, a bit of information, that's where I think we lose out quite a bit. And then the internet came, and Newsweek, of course, had its website, so you had more frequent filing. And there was an upside to that. You know, one of the worst things in a news magazine, for instance, was on Tuesday, I got a scoop. Well, the magazine closes on Saturday, you know, and I have a story none of my colleagues have. But by Thursday, Friday, they've all got it, you know, and nobody. I say, "Oh, I had that first." Well, no, that didn't impress anybody. But the problem is the economic model of journalism just has been transformed and imploded for many publications, including like Newsweek. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, but first of all, the advertising dollars that used to go to the big newspapers, the 3 TV networks, the city newspaper, you know, there was a pretty clear menu for an advertiser. And they'd pick one from this column and one from the news magazines, one for a network and so forth. And operations could have networks of correspondence in the US and abroad, and real bureaus and editors and researchers, fact checkers, all these things. But then the menu just became so huge. First there was cable TV, and then the internet. I was once with a guy when I was still living in New York. I shared a taxi, and he said he's selling advertising, and he said, "Well, I can sell advertising. For instance, I get an order. I want to get women who are between 35 and 40 with 2 kids." And so I get a slice of this website, a slice of this cable channel, a slice of this newspaper. Nobody gets much. And so bureaus began to close, and also publications like Newsweek hadn't figured out how do we even get any revenue from the internet. At first it was all free, except for like the Wall Street Journal was quite smart in putting a paywall right away and getting readers to accept that, but their clientele was more willing to do it. So all of these things created a problem, and that's when things began. You know, there's successive bureaus that I was in that began, like the door was slamming shut every time I left the bureau. I said, "Was it me?" But as much as I thought this was a problem of our age, I thought the late 70s, 80s, and 90s beginning of the 90s were a pretty good time for journalists. But when I was researching my book on Hitlerland about Americans in Germany in the 20s and 30s, at one point I got a tally for how many American journalists there were based in Berlin in the mid-30s, when, of course, Germany was a big story. Someone want to hazard a guess how many full-time American journalists were there then? How many? 50. 50. Can you imagine anywhere in the world now where you'd have 50 American full-time correspondents? For all these kinds of publications, you know, every city had 2 or 3 really serious newspapers. There were radio correspondents. There were news agencies that don't exist anymore. And, you know, I even delved in, I found one of the correspondents' expense reports. It was very impressive. They really,
They faked them even then.
Yeah. There was fake news even then. Yeah, but the expense accounts. But so the question is, what did this do? First of all, to me, I love print. And I love to see someone like you holding out a newspaper, that Alan will get 8 newspapers, and in my case, like the fact physical magazines. But if you can have a model which supports good journalism, how that journalism is consumed doesn't matter to me that much. But this model has failed, and the question is, what's the formula? And then, so where we're going, and I'll end it here. I think one reason why journalism, the whole idea of journalism and the idea of what we used to think in America of sort of objective or at least balanced journalism in a genuine sense has disappeared into this cauldron of opinion, a stream of opinion. Why is there so much opinion and so little reporting? There was a study in Google News, of a Google News one day, back already 10, 12 years ago, by the Poynter Institute, a journalistic institute, and they looked at 14,000 stories churned through Google News that day. It's an aggregator. And they traced those 14,000 stories to 24 or 25 news events. So most of the stories were just sort of playing off stuff that maybe someone like the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette or the AP or the New York Times or maybe a news magazine had actually reported. And everything else was just sort of repackaging. And that's, and what I try to tell young people is find a model where at least you are going out and doing that 26th, 27th story. And that's where we've got a problem because opinion is cheap. As we saw that at Newsweek, they began closing foreign bureaus and began hiring more people who could write opinion pieces just from their desks. And therefore, and then what happens is you begin, if you rely on your readership to give, because of the power of your opinion, you begin to play to the preconceptions of your audience. And that happens on the right, it happens on the left. And everything becomes very predictable, and the whole idea of a counterintuitive story that makes you rethink your assumptions, which used to be the goal, seems to disappear. So that's where I think we need a new model. And there are some new models coming up, but we can get into that. But I think we're in a huge transition phase, and keep buying those 8 newspapers, but I'm afraid that the number of them will dwindle. Yeah.
I come from print mostly, and our paper has had in Pittsburgh has had a downward slide for probably 30 or more years. We never knew where our subscribers were. We didn't know what they wanted, and so it was always a guessing game. And the print edition, and we've gone from 220,000 in 1992 to 80,000 now, although they don't make that number too public the way they used to. The train has left the station on newspapers. There's only going to be a few left. Papers like mine are down to 5 days a week. Lots of towns like Ann Arbor, they disappeared altogether. They're disappearing all over the place. I think the son of a friend of ours works, I don't know if there's still a paper in Dayton, but he's a reporter that does just online. So we're out of there. So the next question is, how are you going to produce news and pay for it? And I think newspapers have a huge advantage because they have small armies that can go report things, whereas as opposed to all these other news sites don't have an army. They have an army in Washington, but they don't have an army in Pittsburgh. I just think, in the end, I think it's really interesting what the hell is going to happen in the future. Our paper did very well. I haven't been in the newsroom in 10 years, so I don't know much. But our newspaper did very well in covering the shootings at the synagogue at Tree of Life. And the way we did well at it is we sent an army of reporters out there, which TV can't do, which the internet really can't do on its own. And they did a heck of a job, and they got a Pulitzer, and it was well-deserved. And that's the first Pulitzer we'd gotten in years. So there's that. So we're done for. So how do we do it? I don't have a clue how you make money. When I read the Times, what I do, and I never made any money, so
that's why we're journalists.
That's why we're journalists. Yeah. The only other guys who were stupider were all you teachers out there who made even less money than we did. And I want to salute all those guys. We have so many teachers, and that was great. I don't know. I don't know what an engagement editor is. Maybe if I were still at the paper, I'd be the engagement editor. The only engagement editor I wrote for a weekly paper when I was in high school, and I did the weddings. And I did once have a bride in an A-frame dress, and they didn't let me do the weddings anymore after the A-frame dress episode. you know, there's a lot of things you like about that. And for me, the way it is now, I check the Times and the Post all day, and that's pretty much what I did.
Not the New York Post.
Not the New York Post. Because these are big organizations that have a lot of smart reporters, I think. And I would do the Journal, but I haven't paid for it yet. And that's, of course, that's what I did as a newspaper guy. I'd get into the office and I'd start screening through what the heck was out there on the AP. And when I worked for the AP, of course, it was the same thing. The tickers were going all day long, so I always knew what was going on. I was never having to wait till the next morning to find out what the news was. I think I love online stuff. I think the train is, Alan's concerns are, the train's left the station on that. There will be some big news organizations left, but I don't think there will be local papers. I don't know how you're going to do local news if you don't have a local news organization that makes money, enough to pay the salaries. I think sports is another, well, I had another little point that was maybe less, it's kind of boring. But one of the weird things, and I wish we had some of our journalists here, like Tom Boswell, you know, the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful sports writer for the Washington Post, who could tell about the demands put on writers like himself to be in so many different kinds of media. I think Boz is probably, because I don't see him on other kinds of media, he's probably avoided it. But it must be trying to have to blog, to have to tweet, to have to appear on the cable news, to have to write your story.
And now
whoops, wait a minute.
Sometimes to video your story.
Yeah, video your story, and then you have to report it. Wait a minute, when do you do the reporting when you have to do all this other shit? I never even liked to worry about giving photo assignments. I thought that was an imposition on my reporting. So that was frowned on. Well, there you are. I don't know. I think it's. I'm not unhopeful. I think I'm not pessimistic. I think that the decline in newspaper readership, my kids are in their 40s, they never bought a newspaper. They're very political. They're very up to date. Never have they owned newspapers. So this has been a long decline. You can't blame it on the internet altogether. Yeah. I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah. I mean, I just add on that the generational thing. I've often taught a writing class, and when I started to do it, it was very easy to say, for instance, explain the basic components of a newspaper. What's the difference between news analysis, personal column, editorial? You see it in the geography of that physical newspaper. Well, now nobody's seen the geography of the physical newspaper anymore in that generation, and it becomes much harder to explain. And on the web, that sort of disappears, that whole set of distinctions, and creates that blending together. I helped start a number of foreign editions for Newsweek in the last part of my job, and one thing I would try to do in Europe, for instance, most publications are pretty clearly identifiable as more left, more right, more affiliated with the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats in Germany or whichever. And I'd say, when we were doing startup, in some cases they say, well, what are we? I said, you want to keep your readers guessing, because you should be able to tell a story and let the facts tell the story, and your analysis flow from the facts rather than the other way around. Now, I think we've gotten more into that European model, in part because of the medium, and again, because of that economic model. Everybody's struggling to hold on to their base of readers. And that's
that was always a question for us, is how do you get people to be addicted to the newspaper? Yeah. And it's true. I think people in newspapers especially got addicted. I got addicted reading the comics with my dad at lunchtime. He'd bring the Boston Herald home and give me the comics when I was little. Other guys in our sports department, I remember them saying they got addicted reading the box scores. I think a lot of you, and people still buy the paper for the puzzle. So, we always had to balance when we were trying to figure out how to reduce this cost, how to keep those things. The stock pages, when I was business editor at one point, that was in the 90s, great hoo-ha when we would try to reduce the stock pages. and do only some of them, or don't do the mutuals, or now they're gone altogether because it didn't make any sense in the 90s either. People were not trading based on what you printed in the paper. Those were old prices already. People could get newer prices. So they're all gone.
Well, I think.
Where was I going with
well,
this?
print has always sold ads. It's in other words, the New York Times would have an article on the inauguration next to a bra and girdle ad. I mean, and when there was a plane crash, or you'd never have a TWA ad in the paper.
No,
It's called an insert order. If there was
We had one once. It didn't work out.
Yeah, it didn't work out
well.
Yeah.
If there was a report on smoking, the cigarette companies would say, we won't pay for any ads if you run one. So we know that print media has always been a vehicle, but when John Hockenberry said something in 1994, I was visiting the museum, it stayed with me. He said, the internet, I predict, is going to make people like us news, meaning we're going to look for what we only want to read. And I think that's where the internet does make a big difference and where it has been, I think, destructive. One quote, and then we'd love to open it up. There's very little critical discussion from that same book, Are We All Addicts Now? There's been very little critical discussion in mainstream culture about the gamification of everything, which replaces individual agency with a kind of soft coercion. Variable schedules of reward are one of the most powerful tools that companies use to hook users. Levels of dopamine surge when the brain is expecting a reward. Introducing variability multiplies the effect, creating a frenzied hunting state. When Barbara lands on Pinterest, not only does she see the images she intended to find, but she's also served a multitude of other glittering objects. Before she knows it, she spent 45 minutes scrolling. Let's hear from you. What do you think?
I want to make one other point. Newspapers, it's a process of filtering. It always has been. The reporter about what's news. And the reporter decides, well, that's newsworthy. It goes up the step. The editor decides that's newsworthy, and then the editor would say of the front page, I would say that's more newsworthy than this, so I'll put this on the front page. I still think that's what news organizations, big newspaper organizations, do. People will argue that the Times is so anti-Trump they can't get out of their own way, but I still think they have editors, and they try to figure out what's really important. And that's what we do. And so I don't really buy the notion that there's nothing but opinion out there. That there is no real news.
No, there are plenty of good reporters out there. The number of organizations that field them has has gone down, and the number of editors has gone down in many cases. Yep. But there are new models. I'll just say very quickly before we turn it over. You look at something like Politico, or even NPR, which of course is a totally different model. Politico has just, I happen to know the guy who's taken it over. He's, surprise, surprise, a good generation younger than us. And they are finding ways to do local or very specialized news. They do a general news thing, but the way they make money, as I understand it, is they do really special reports it can be and conferences for companies, for municipalities, and I'm not sure how that's going to work, but I think the next generation is going to have to figure that out. But they are feeling, I'm astonished, he started a Politico in Europe with a huge staff in Brussels and London, and a network of correspondents that's beginning to be quite impressive and doing good work. So there are new ways of doing it. It's just, I think, you got to have a totally creative mind in terms of the business sense and in the editorial sense to make that happen.
So you wouldn't rule out advising an Amherst student to go into journalism?
No, but do so at your own peril. I mean, do it. I always said, even in the days when David and I were just starting, and he'd say, should we follow this path? If you value security, stability, probably not. You've got to be able to. It's a crapshoot in journalism. Even in the old days, it was. Now, even more so. And you have to be able. You have to be able to do things that I'm sure David and I no longer know how to do. I couldn't do the number of multitasking presentation things, editing my own video, and so forth that a lot of these young journalists now have to do.
So go ahead. Yeah. Questions.
Sure.
Thank you for your comments. Could I ask a question about journalism in a politicized time. With, on the one hand, concerns about fake news, on the other hand, there's Julian Assange. What is news, and what concerns, if any, do you have about Assange and Wikipedia, in effect, being charged with espionage? And for those of us whose hearing are going, could I ask you guys to speak directly into the mic?
Oh, Robert, you get right to the point. Yeah, you want to take?
No, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, David.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's always been a tension in terms of leaks, information. It's one thing for leaks. I think journalists, and we've all hunted for leaks. We've all cultivated sources. I think if you're working in a post where you have access to classified information and you have made a commitment not to divulge this information, you do so at your own peril. And I don't think it's and if somebody gets in trouble or loses their job or worse for that, it's not, that's something that's it's part of the course of doing business. One thing I did try to do always, and particularly, for instance, reporting from the Soviet Union in the old days where everything was considered national security information, is tell the people, it's one thing to deal with people who were openly dissidents or trying to fight the system, and they knew the risks, and they felt that at least if they dealt with a Western correspondent like me, the authorities will know that if something happens to them, somebody else will know about it, and they took a calculated risk. But there were often people who sort of walked in, or who I'd meet and say, I want to tell you about this, that, and the other, or do this, and will you cover it? For instance, I had a couple of women saying their husbands were in the Gulag. What would you think if we went out on Red Square and put up posters, held up posters? Will this be covered in the Western press? In other words, well, first of all, they would have been, swept up by the KGB in a matter of seconds. I said, I don't think there's any chance, almost no chance that it will be covered by the Western press because they won't see it. And I didn't want to do anything to encourage them to do something like that. But Assange, I think there's still stealing information, just dumping information. I think that is still good.
He wasn't going to be swept up by the Russian authorities.
No, and he was not going to be swept up. But that's a totally different case. And there is it's just like if you walked into an office and grabbed things off people's desks. That there are things which there should be consequences for, and then if you receive that information, then there's a whole different next layer. Whether do you just dump stuff, as for instance BuzzFeed did with some of the stuff, like with what? P-tape. The P-tape, the Steele dossier, which was, anybody who knew anything about Russia would say this is really, really sketchy, do you say just because you have it, do you publish it all, and without any critical thinking, any context? So that's the part that's really a problem, I think, for news organizations. Others have been more systematic in having editors who say we will consider putting this out and maybe not mentioning these names or this particular situation, and trying to at least establish some context for it.
I think. Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to add to that the most important thing for newspapers to have is a BS detector, and some things are BS, like Andy was saying on that part of that the P-tape. That was, if you knew Russia, you knew that wasn't true, and that's what's lost.
Mike,
you just said don't believe the P-tape.
Yeah, don't believe the P-tape. Oh, no, what I'm saying is the most important thing for any newspaper is to have good bullshit detectors, and that's the whole system. And like Andy was saying, the tape from the dossier was clear to some people that was baloney, and so you don't do it. You just got to have your antenna up all the time, but you do go.
My name is Gerald Riley. I'm here with the Fastfading class of 1949. for our last hurrah. We were not crowded in the dorm with the roof. I was involved in newspapers for 40 years, and two quotations have set up as bookends of that industry. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "Given the choice between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I would unhesitatingly choose the latter." So that guided journalism students for years. Then the more recent one was, when the Holocaust is over, stop trembling, waters receded, two species will be found to have survived: cockroaches and weekly newspapers. And I'm a great believer in...
Did he say news magazines?
Well, I'm totally familiar with everything in the industry, from Gannett in one paper and so. I worked with Murdoch when he first came into the country and so and so. I'll give you one number to show how fast it's faded. Easy number. At its peak, the New York Times company was using 600,000 metric tons of newsprint every year. Just a little below 100,000 today. Yeah. The money is gone. We could lick the telegraph, radio, television, cable. Internet killed us. Gone. There's just no way to replace it. Yeah. It's not the same. It's information of a sort, no context, no proportionality, no balance, no nuance, but that generation, my children, that's enough. They got the thing, I got enough. Yeah. It isn't enough, and the country will be ill-served by the absence of newspapers, I'm afraid, which are fast fading, because it just isn't the same on what the whole country was planned for. That's what the whole amendment was about. But thank you. I came in late. You may have covered this before. I'm sorry.
Say that there was nothing more fake news than the newspapers of the early 19th century. The newspapers of the early 19th century, after Jefferson, they were fake news absolutely, completely.
He's done his great damage. That is terrible. Thank you.
So I want to go back to something David touched on earlier about the traditional role of newspapers, certainly in the pre-internet age. They told us what was important. So whether it was the bombing of Cambodia or the civil rights movement, managing editors, the editorial staff, decided for the readership as curators really what was vital news for us to know. Now in the post-internet age, a lot of the news gathering online is driven by audience metrics in terms of they're measuring what is successful, what is being clicked on, right. What are people reading. And the amount of information they get from that is tremendously detailed and, as you know, affects what we see. Yeah. So my question to the panel really is what is your general feeling about audience metrics being used to decide what news is important? In other words, is it a good thing that the audience is deciding what news is important versus the managing editor?
Yeah. Okay.
You know, I was in on hundreds of, maybe not that, yeah, hundreds of front page meetings. And this is what the decision would be every day. And it was never, we could never measure. We would have focus groups, and it would always come out that people really like local news. Well, it turns out if you over-focus on local news, people don't read it. And the fight was always, what people should know, what people want to know, and we never, we could never resolve that because we didn't really know what people wanted to know. There are all kinds of metrics. In our newsroom now, I'm told, there's a, whatever it is, chart beat. Yeah. So your story's up there and you know the number of clicks. At one of the papers, I've read that people were laid off based on the number of clicks. You have to get a number of clicks. But the curating, I think, still goes on. The way the Times, and these are the ones I read because I think they are curated. They do put what they think is the most important story for me to know on top. I always, as I was an old-fashioned dinosaur on, I really wanted to tell people what was the most important story in the world that day in column 6. And everybody else, a lot of the other people would say, oh, nobody cares about Beirut. Well, I care about Beirut, and people ought to care about Beirut. But it was almost a syndrome in newspapers in the, oh, that Beirut Civil War did last a long time. But, yeah, I still think you need to get curated news. I think there is curated news, and that's, that's why I depend on the papers, big papers. That's how they'll survive, is with curated news.
And just a quick addendum to that. If you looked at when this first started, for instance, when Newsweek first got its website, I remember talking to the woman who ran the website, and she said, now we can measure things we could never measure before. They couldn't measure exactly how many people read your stories, and that has its good side. But the bad side is, if you want to be sure that you get a lot of clicks, you put hot cheerleaders in the headline, and you do. But that doesn't mean you're going to fill up the website or the magazine or the newspaper with those kinds of stories. And I think the curated part of it is still very important, and that the notion of just clicks versus credibility. Now I think both, I've visited the Times newsroom and the Journal newsroom in the last few years with students, and they all have those somewhere, that board with all that. But I think the trick is not to become too obsessive about it, but it's there, and it does play a big role.
Just want to add one thing. We will wrap it up in just a minute. I'm told that in this attention economy, that's what the world of the cyberspace is called now. There are, in the attention economy, that there are upwards, every time you're online, every single time you are online, thinking that you're doing a one-to-one communication or checking Facebook, there are upwards of 1,000 individuals out there who have access to your data and will have access and will use your data to create whatever it is they want to reach you with. John, we just want to thank you for your question, too, and hope that people will attend your session this afternoon at 3 o'clock on, what's it called? Now Hear This? Okay. And we do have time for one or two more, or one more.
I got a mic.
Let's go right ahead.
I live in Canada, and Toronto still has 3 daily papers. I now live in Victoria. There are so many print magazines that one of them titled itself Yet Another Magazine. And when I travel to Europe, my impression, and Andy probably has a much better read, is that the situation for print media is not as bad in Europe. And it doesn't seem to be as bad in Canada as it currently is in the US. And my question is, why is that the case?
We're trendsetters. No, I mean, that is true. When we were starting these new print editions of Newsweek in the early 2000s, and people were saying, why? It's clear the trend's going the other way. For a while, for instance, the Newsweek edition in Poland, which I started, at a certain point had more newsstand sales than the U.S. edition of Newsweek. Yeah, it got to that point. But the editors told me, this is going to change. These things tend to migrate. And now I was there a couple of months ago and met with one of the former editors, and he said, yeah, our print edition has gone down. The advertising is tougher. We see all the same trends. It just takes a while. Le Monde just announced a bunch of layoffs. So, I think there is maybe a stronger, the stronger identification with traditional big publications like Le Monde or, in Germany, Die Welt and various publications. But it's not going to prevent the same process from happening. And that's why, for instance, Political Europe, I think one of the ways they introduced this new product called Political Europe, spinning off Political US, has been surprisingly successful because they're beginning to fill some of the gaps that the local European publications are beginning to open up. So I think in Canada it will probably be moving in that direction. It doesn't mean that there won't be new publications or some others won't reinvent themselves, but they're going to have to do something. They can't just assume that they can maintain that position for a very long time.
I want to thank you for coming, and you can turn your smartphones back on. I hope you won't. But let's give it up for David and Andy.